Aye.
Aye. To the contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you, members. That takes us to item 10, members. Now, this is a private plan change request, or Hara Farm, some 32.5 hectares of land in Waiuku, down on our southwestern border. It's currently rural mixed zone, and the proposal is to plan change it to residential mixed housing urban. Now, there's motions before us, members, and I will move accordingly. Deputy Mayor, you're comfortable with those motions? If so, would you second?
Yes, I'll second. It has to go through the process, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So those motions are before us, members. Please note the red, and Kalinda, if you can make sure that we can see everything on the screen, if you could scroll up and down as members require, particularly noting the red in addition to what's in the agenda. And I will now hand to Celia Davison, Manager of Planning Central South, to introduce Chloe Trinouth, our consultant planner on this matter.
So Chloe is the reporting planner today. She's also our processing planner for the whole plan change. The report is really getting a request, clause 25, or the request for a decision on whether we proceed to process this plan change. So I'll pass over to Chloe because she's prepared a presentation and we can both answer questions. Thanks. Bye. Not bye. Thank you.
Morena, apologies, my camera seems to have just cut out, so I am a black screen, but I am here.
We can also see you.
You can, okay, because I can't see me, so that's good. Okay, I won't make any sudden movements then. I have a presentation that I can share with you and run through. Shall I go through that now?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, hold on a second. So the plan change is a private plan change at Constable Road in Waiuku, which is a rural town. The plan change is, so the Waiuku is, I've got another image of where it is in the southern sub-regional context, but the plan change is identified there by the red star. It's on the edge of the existing township. Next to it is a recent subdivision that's happening, residential subdivision. Then there's Waiuku College, so it's right on the edge there, and these here are some rugby park fields. So here's the location of Waiuku, the base of the Awhitu Peninsula. It's on the near the bottom of the southern boundary of the region. So basically the boundary to Waikato Regional Council is just right here on Constable Road, about probably less than 500 metres down the road. Then Waiuku has a direct relationship with Pukekohe and the southern sub-region. This image here is provided by the applicant to show the proximity of the plan change to the town centre. So the plan change is about 32.5 hectares. It's currently mixed rural zone, and they're seeking mixed housing urban. I could make that map a little bit bigger if that would be helpful. I just have to escape from the presentation and blow it up. Or are people able to see that okay?
We also have it on Nexus, so we can enlarge ourselves. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. What this is, image is useful in showing the proximity of the town centre. So we've got the walking 800 standard 800 metre walking radius that's usually used, and you can see that part of the plan changes within that. Most of the plan changes outside of it, but it is in close proximity. So it's next to the high school. There's a number of parks in the area. There's a supermarket at the edge of the town centre down the road there. There's a library at the end of Constable Road. So it's in close relatively close proximity to a lot of the services and amenities of the township. So the current zoning, as I said, is mixed rural. The adjoining zones are mixed housing suburban. So originally this plan change did seek mixed housing suburban, but has amended it to be mixed housing urban to reflect the recent RM Enabling Housing Supply Act, which introduces medium density residential standards, and in order for the plan change to progress, it needs to be consistent with that. So the mixed housing urban zone is the most consistent with that. But the proposal is still for the same. They haven't changed the capacity that they're seeking and anticipate approximately 700 dwellings there. There are no real overlays or precincts or particular controls that have any particular consequence. There is obviously the aquifer, and there'll be, you know, the main thing for that is making sure there's no contamination of that, and then the macroinvertebrate index there for ecological consideration. And this map just shows the zoning in the vicinity as well in terms of the town centre and other zones. So there's a number of different residential zones in Waiuku. There's actually, which I haven't shown, to the right, to the east, a large area of large lot residential. So there's large lot residential, mixed housing, suburban, single housing, and mixed housing urban. So it's got all of the zones in there for residential. Really doesn't have THAB though. In terms of topography and hydrology, these maps just to give a quick overview of what the sort of main features of the site. There are no water features or streams on the site. The Rangifea stream is in relatively close proximity, so it drains to that stream. There is a tributary that comes up towards that western corner, but what we're seeing on the site here are really overland flow paths and the indentation of the land that where water might pool. So the floodplains are relating to those overland flow paths rather than any large floodplains. And then you can see on the right here the topography. It's a relatively undulating, not particularly steep site. The highest part of the site is here at Constable Road. There's a bit of an escarpment there, which they'll be looking to largely retain. And this down here just shows the lower part. This is the lowest part of the site where the water will run to. So just an overview of transport infrastructure. Waiuku is essentially largely a self-sustaining or self-sufficient rural town. It has large areas of employment. They've got a recently zoned employment area that's been constructed at the moment, as well as its proximity to Glenbrook industrial area and Pukekohe. So the journey to work stats indicate that 56% of workers travel within Waiuku or the immediate surrounding area. So then the stats, and I've got that over here on the right hand side, show that very few people that live in Waiuku are actually travelling to the CBD. So it's really a southern sub-regional travel pattern. The strategic transport network is really those main roads out of Waiuku that connect to Pukekohe and to South Auckland. So Linwood Road through to Hingaia, and then Glenbrook Road that connects up to State Highway 22 between Pukekohe and Drury. Obviously there will be additional train stations as we know at Drury West and Pairata, which will help to service this area as well. But there is no identified impacts on that strategic network from the applicant's assessment. They've basically, their assessment is that there's only local roading impacts. So that will need to be assessed in further detail when we consider the merits of the plan change. There is existing bus services, so there's one from Waiuku to the Papakura station, and there's one from Waiuku to the Pukekohe station. So we can see that the service to Papakura station is only, they've got 2 in the morning and 2 in the evening for commuter service, and the one to Pukekohe is a bit more frequent, but obviously not a particularly frequent bus network there due to the size of the population. Water and wastewater infrastructure is in place in Waiuku for the existing population and the settlements around it. In terms of water, it's groundwater bore. The assessment and discussion with Watercare is that the plan change would require additional water abstraction consent, so that means the volume of abstraction they can take at the moment would have to be extended in order to provide for this plan change. There'd be the usual upgrade to local networks that happen with any urban extension, and there would also be an upgrade to the water treatment plant, plant, required to be considered, and that conversation still needs to happen in further detail with Watercare around how that would happen. In terms of wastewater, there's an existing wastewater treatment plant that would need to be upgraded to accommodate the additional flows from this plan change and the usual upgrades to the local network. There is also the Sub-West Sub-Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant that has been planned for a while at, I believe it's at Clark's Beach, to capture the growth anticipated at King's Seat, Clark's Beach, Glenbrook Beach, Waiuku, in that general area. So the issue with that is, whilst that's being proposed and will provide additional capacity, there's a question as to whether or not it is designed to accommodate this additional growth. So at the moment it's been planned and designed on the growth that's anticipated. This is an additional 700 dwellings that isn't currently on the radar because we didn't know it was going to be happening or on the cards. So that may require, or is likely to require, the existing consent to be revised in order to increase the flows and discharge from that additional development. So that's an issue that would need to be worked through. Key features of the site are soils. So there are elite and prime soils on this site. So using the council's unitary plan definitions, there's approximately 17% of elite soils. That's the blue here through the bottom of the site, and then approximately 64% LUC class 2 and 3 prime soils. Now this map doesn't quite match that because the applicant's assessment, which I've got down here, is the same in terms of elite soil, so that's the 17%. In terms of prime land, they've excluded this area, which is actually meets the definition of the unitary plan as being prime, but is an area of peat soil and is very wet. So when you then assess the productive potential of that soil for horticulture, the assessment has excluded that as being prime land. So then that, if you did that, and that again needs to be tested through the merits of the plan change, that would reduce the amount of usable prime land to 24%, meaning that over approximately 59% of the site is not usable for productive purposes. The other thing to note on this map is this site here is 45A Constable Road. That is the back of what has recently been developed for residential housing. They have an earthworks consent that covers the whole site, and that has been earthworked, so there is no productive soils left on that site, therefore it wasn't included in the soils assessment. But I've included that in terms of the percentages of the overall plan change. And we're talking about, when we say 17%, I think it's like 5 hectares. So the numbers of hectares are relatively small in comparison when you're looking at the proportions. And that is the end of the slideshow, so I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Celia. Just at the top, before I take a question from the Deputy Mayor, probably for you, Celia, excuse me, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. Look, I don't have the words in front of me, but it referred to the need for territorial authorities to respond to plan changes. Can you just tell us, I think this might be one of the first plan changes that's come before us since that NPSUD come in. I could be incorrect in that regard. Can you just tell us, take us through how council has to respond to plan changes as per the NPSUD?
So if they are recently lodged, like this particular one, if they show that they are going to incorporate, or there's an ability to incorporate the medium density, the MDRS, the medium density standards for the particular medium density housing, then that can proceed. It can proceed and be processed as normal through the Schedule 1 process. So that one, if once it gets through and gets its decision, then we can, it will just go into the unitary plan as per normal. And by that stage, we will, in August, when we include the changes to the plan through our intensification plan change, we will be including all the MDRS standards into that. And that will be aligned and in every single relevant residential zone. And once this plan change comes in with an MHU zoning, the MDRS will be incorporated and applied to this piece of land as well. So by having it as an MHU zoning, I think originally they came in with a mixed housing suburban zoning, and now they've changed it to a mixed housing urban zoning in order to have more alignment with the mixed density, medium density residential standards. So they have got a statement in the provisions to say that they are that is the intention, so that when it goes out for notification, the public are clear that the medium density residential standards will be incorporated into into that zone. So yeah, so it can proceed.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got further questions on that, but I'll firstly go to the Deputy Mayor, followed by Member Wilcox, please. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, staff, for the presentation. Yeah, this one has come out of the blue a little bit. I wasn't expecting it. My first question is concerning the commercial and quasi-industrial estate that's been newly developed. Do we know how many jobs are potentially going to be created there?
Through the chair, there was a reference to that in the economic assessment. I don't have it to hand. I can have a quick look at that. I'd have to come back to you, sorry.
That's all right. I think it's a reasonable number.
It is a reasonable number, yes.
The other question I have is, this is a large development. You know, it's 2,100 to 2,500 people, basically. That what, on a percentage rate, what would that increase the township of Waiuku by?
I believe the population is around somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000. So that would be a large increase, yes. 25
to 30% increase now. And then my last question is to do with the wastewater. You mentioned that, and I know that Watercare's work has been held up by an appeal, which I think has been resolved, and they're hopefully planning on carrying on works. But they weren't predicting this amount of growth in one sort of whack. So this developer would, I imagine, have to contribute a substantial amount for that new plant development, and I guess those talks will be had with them over the time, but that's going to also be challenging for them, I would imagine. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. Now I'll go to Independent Māori Statutory Board Member Glenn Wilcox. Glenn, kia ora.
Thank you, Chair. Has any in-depth discussion occurred regarding transport in and out of Waiuku?
Kia ora, through the chair. The the integrated transport assessment that was prepared by the applicant has identified that most of the traffic would go along King Street and through the two roundabouts that are there, but has not indicated that that would have any significant impact on the way that those intersections currently work. So I understand from his assessment they're currently at a level of service sort of A or B, which is the highest level of service, and the assessment did not indicate there'd be any significant reduction to that. I suspect that will be an ongoing issue of investigation as the plan change progresses.
Yes, I think my concern is and again, this will come out, is up there by the hospital. I mean, that's the only way out, basically. And so there's a real issue there. The second one is the impact on the rugby club. With having 700 houses up there, what will this mean? Because, you know, we've had it, especially up in the west, where neighbours get a bit cranky when people at the club are practicing at 8 o'clock at night. Have we kind of thought about this recreational kaupapa that's going to now impact on the town? If we've got what is it, 2,500 people living there? My God.
Thank you. Through the chair, yes, there is some provisions in the precinct to provide for some, just trying to think what it is, I think it's fencing and screening, but obviously that would be relatively minor in terms of I don't think it would address, I think your concern would be around the noise issue. Don't think that issue specifically has been considered. It's been looked at more in relation to the benefits that having that open space in proximity to the plan change would be, and then also the potential to take a road through that plan change area and provide additional connection to the Auckland Council land there. So no, it's not a specific issue that I think has been addressed, and I'd have to check as to whether or not they've actually consulted directly with the rugby club.
Okay. And finally, so we've only got the New World and the Foursquare in town. Are they able to cope with the extra people that will now live in the town, or could we be thinking of building another supermarket in town? And do we have the land?
Through the chair, I did, when I met with the applicants and did a site visit, just coincidentally, they did mention that there was a countdown coming. However, I have no way of verifying that, so that's merely a comment that I heard. So I couldn't comment on that, really.
Chair, could I just ask one more question? Have we done a structure plan for Waiuku? And that's my final question.
No, we haven't.
Celia? We haven't.
No.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Celia.
Sorry, no, we haven't.
Thank you, Celia. Thank you, Member Wilcox. I'll now go to Councillor Henderson, please.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions from me. First and foremost, I'm a little bit confused about the soil quality issue. So when we're addressing prime and elite soils, assessing them, do we not take into account things like how damp it is? Because if it's not usable for the purposes of prime and elite soils, doesn't that defeat the purpose of the classification in the first place?
So through the chair, recently at the hearing for Plan Change 55 for Patamahoe, Council provided legal submissions around clarification of interpreting the framework for the definitions of land containing elite soil and land containing prime soil. And I guess there's a process. So yes, first and foremost, in terms of prime soil, there's a basic definition that says if your land use classification is 2 or 3, you are prime soil. Then you need to go through an assessment that determines whether or not that has actually got productive potential, and in terms of the RPS policies, is significant for food production. So it's like a sieving process, I guess. You first got to identify, does it meet that definition, and then whether or not it warrants protection. So you're right, it's not just about the classification.
Okay, that makes sense. And just the last question from me, but there may or may not be a follow-up. I hope I'm not the only one that's a little bit confused by the climate impact assessment. I was wondering if you could talk us through it, please.
So I think I'm acknowledging in the agenda report that obviously there is the council's policy directives to reduce vehicle emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, and just to acknowledge that this is a rural town which does, although it has a bus service, is pretty limited, and so will be largely car dominant, and that is identified and acknowledged in the applicant's integrated transport assessment. I think the question, or I guess what I'm trying to say there is, we don't, for the purposes of this consideration and assessment, there's nothing to indicate that it's a matter that you would use to potentially reject it, but it is a matter that would need to be considered further in terms of considering the merits of the application. So I'm acknowledging it, but I guess I'm not saying whether or not it's particularly contrary to it, other than yes, it is going to increase vehicle kilometres, so therefore would have an increase potentially in greenhouse gases.
Just one follow-up. Thank you, Chair. So if we are to vote through and accept this plan change today, would that be kind of giving support to that view that actually more climate impact assessment is needed, or would we be accepting that actually there are impacts on climate change that are negative?
Through the Chair, I think it needs to be given further consideration. It's an issue that Auckland Transport has also raised in terms of their concerns with the plan change. Ultimately, if the plan change is accepted and goes through the assessment, there's obviously a range of matters that need to be considered, not just this one. So it would have to be assessed in the context with everything else that has to be considered. And yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Member Karen Wilson, please.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chloe, for that comprehensive presentation. Look, my IT is really bad at the moment. I can't even see my Nexus, let alone the item necessarily, but I'm going to moot it in this way. I'm aware that a CVA was submitted by Ngāti Tiata Waiuku, and I'm wondering what consideration in terms of this application was given that, and specifically, and I might be winging it here in the sense I can't see anything, Schedule 1, 25 4. So I'm asking what, if anything, cognizance in terms of the application has been taken of that. Has it been signalled in Ngāti Tiata's CVA that this has significance, and was it matched up, the application, in terms of the schedule that refers to that impact? Hopefully that makes sense, Chloe.
Okay, I'll just have a quick. So 25.
Subsection 4.
So in terms of the CVA, the applicant consulted directly with Ngāti Tiata, obviously, and commissioned the CVA. They have committed to ongoing engagement through the process. They have included a number of provisions in the precinct to try and reflect the CVA in terms of expectations for consultation, also specifics around integrated stormwater management and riparian planting, and the process for naming of roads and things like that, which would happen at subdivision stage. In terms of your query around clause 25.4, I'm just trying to understand, is this in terms of, I guess, are you thinking around best practice consultation? Is that sort of the question that you're asking that clarity on?
Yes, so in terms of the CVA that was submitted and the ability for council to look at that, plus the application to be able to include or not notification, I guess in terms of objecting, Chloe, I think that's what I'm trying to say around that subsection. And was that considered in terms of this application? And if so, were there any matters that need to be, I hear from the previous kōrero, investigated or more more inquiry needed to be made is really what I suppose I'm driving on.
Okay. Well, the CVA is fairly extensive in terms of describing all of, not all, I'm sure not all, but Ngāti Te Ata's interests and history with the area and all of the concerns that they would like to see addressed. In my review of that in the precinct plan provisions that have been provided, I think that it generally implements that. I obviously can't speak for Ngāti Te Ata in terms of whether that's their view and whether they expected to see more in the precinct, but I would expect that to occur through either the submission process if they wanted to make a submission, or through their ongoing engagement with the applicant themselves if they wish to see a better reflection of their CVA in the precinct provisions. So at this point, I think it appears to be consistent with what the CVA from Ngāti Te Ata was indicating.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you, Member Wilson. And Councillor Hills now, please.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. And I guess Councillor Henderson took part of my question around the climate impact statement, just how we're supposed to consider climate change since it's coming with the RMA changes anyway, but also we're required to, as a council, and we have a climate plan if that is supposed to be considered as part of our plans and policies. So first is the climate. The second is why I've read why we can't reject it, but I guess I want to investigate that further around sound resource management practice. As the Deputy Mayor said, that it is a significant increase in population. We know that it will be car movements, but also the developer says that there is capacity in the water infrastructure, but Watercare says there isn't. And there's no plan for this in the future urban land supply program. So I'm just wondering, the threshold seems ridiculously high for a rejection if none of that could be considered for a rejection. So I guess I just want clear advice again on why none of that is considered for potential rejection when it sort of goes against everything, the Auckland plan, the climate plan, everything else the council's doing. Thank you.
Back to you, Chloe.
Through the chair, I think from my perspective looking at this, one of the things we need to consider, or I am considering for myself, is the fact that Waiuku is a rural town. It's existing, it has the schools, it has largely the amenities that one needs, and generally people have employment in relatively close proximity. So we're not talking about a entirely isolated sort of dormitory residential community that has to get in their car for absolutely everything that they need to do. There are options available for walking and cycling. Yes, there would be car travel, but I guess in a southern sub-regional community, it is not, it's within the context of that community, I expect, and it's not that, I guess the information that's been provided that will need to be tested more is whether or not the travel will be local. If the travel does start to, if the proportion of journey to work was showing that 80% of people in Waiuku were travelling to the CBD, then I think it would be a slightly different assessment, because that would obviously be more vehicle kilometres travelled and a significantly greater increase than if they are actually shorter trips or don't even have to be vehicle trips for some of their day-to-day activities, and particularly going to school. I hope that answers that climate change question a little bit more, but not.
Yeah.
Councillor Hills, you heard?
I guess the issue I have is that if you're looking at a 20 to 25% increase in population, I couldn't really see how you wouldn't expect, unless we're suddenly providing 20%, and I know the numbers don't work exactly, but a 20% increase in job capacity within Waiuku, or the surrounding suburbs. I would assume, and especially if they're going for mixed housing urban, that there would be a slightly different mix of population, potentially younger people, families coming from outside the area. So you would assume that the car travel to the city, because there is no public transport, would be high. Not to the city, but definitely further than just local. Yeah, I just couldn't imagine that not happening.
Sure, through the chair, so the economic analysis that's provided to support this plan change is very much identifying a gap in the Waiuku's housing market for the older population, and the need to provide options for ageing in place, because there are no, I think there's a very small retirement village in Waiuku, otherwise people have to move to Pukekohe or elsewhere. So that is part of, whilst that's not the primary, they're not, obviously we don't know whether that will be the outcome, but that is certainly part of their assessment. So not just the fact that there's, in the applicant's view, demand for housing in Waiuku, they're specifically looking at the demand for 55 plus. So, I mean, obviously people 55 plus still work, so it's not to suggest that reduces necessarily the travel, but the demographic of what that community may be could be quite varied.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Councillor Hills.
Just on the
Councillor Hills again.
Just sorry, Chair, on the infrastructure, just how when we know the massive bill we have coming for the areas that we've already got approved that we don't have funding for, what is the basis to reject it based on the fact that even Watercare says there's no budget allowance for that?
Through the chair, my understanding is that whilst it's not planned for and therefore there's no funding identified for it, what the applicant's assessment demonstrates in their view is that there is capacity. Now, whilst Watercare has come back and said that's not the case in their view, these conversations do tend to develop somewhat through the process, and it usually comes down to who's going to pay. So if there was no sub-regional wastewater treatment plant on the cards, it may be a more significant issue, but there is actually something being developed, and I think there are options for the developer to be able to contribute to that, which would need to be worked through with Watercare, and I fully anticipate that Watercare would do a submission on this, like they did for Patumahoe.
Kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora, thank you. Well, members, welcome to responding to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the Enabling Housing Supply Act, if it might be called that, but it is legislation now. And here we find ourselves having to contend with that now. Our choices are limited. So I just want to go probably to you, Celia, and I don't know whether you were on the call earlier. I probably asked the question in the wrong place. The question of the government leading in its resource management reforms on a national policy statement to protect productive land. We know that in the nation and in Auckland, we've lost some 95% of our wetlands. That is just inexcusable. And we're fast going in that direction in the loss of elite and prime soils. You know, the food basket lands that surround Auckland, I think some 20% of the nation's vegetables or particular vegetables come out of that Pukekohe catchment, for example. It doesn't just feed Auckland, it feeds the nation. So question to you, Celia, why, and surely it can't be just because of COVID, has government not come forth with its national policy statement on productive land? We've already been grappling with these issues on a private plan change in Clevedon, private plan change in Patumahoe, and now a private plan change here in Waiuku. What does your unit know about the MPS on productive land?
So we've actually got we got Ryan, who we spoke to Ryan, who is our person who knows a lot about the MPS not MPS on soils, and he has been in conversation with the ministry to find out what is happening. The latest he's got is that they are thinking that they will be releasing something in about April or May of this year. So that's the latest information that we have. But according to Ryan, he's telling us that they've told us this before. So we can't guarantee that that's going to happen, or we can't expect that to happen. But I think that that's the latest information we have, is that it's approximately April, May, that something may be released around the soils NPS.
Sorry, what's the something?
That's not
I haven't
guaranteed.
had. What is the something, though? I haven't had a reply to my letter to the minister regarding this of March last year. Now, and I understand that our staff have been struggling to get information out of their colleagues at the Ministry for the Environment. So what is the something? Is it an MPS? Is it a memo? Is it a...
It's just emails between Ryan and officers in the ministry. That's all there is.
I'm asking, what is the something that's going to be released in the month you identified?
Hold on. So he's saying that that they anticipate that they will get the NPS soils through the cabinet for gazetting in late March or April, and it will take effect 28 days after gazetting.
Okay,
that's the latest he's got on that.
That's better. That's the MPS productive land is imminent.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah.
Okay, that is good news. Okay, that might address in part the motion asking myself and the Deputy Chair to follow up on that. Okay, I look forward to that. Can I just go to the mixed housing urban zoning that has been updated? Initially, they were looking at single house zone and mixed housing suburban. Am I correct? That the 700 dwelling unit yield, is that if there was a mixed housing urban build out to the feasible level, or can you tell us something more, Chloe, about what the developer expects to build out? So I guess my question there is the intention of the developer, who originally wanted to just go for single house zone and mixed housing suburban, and still can still build that and not go, 3-story mixed housing urban, is that the yield you're talking about, or is the yield of 700 dwelling units and 2,500 people, is that the product of a full build out of a mixed housing urban to the limits permitted by mixed housing urban?
Thank you. So yes, you're right. They initially sought mixed housing suburban, and the calculation there was 700 dwellings. They've then updated the zone, but they haven't changed the build out. So their economic assessment in response to the MDRS implications of doing that is that their market assessment is that the maximum MDRS 3 dwellings, 3 stories built form would not be something that the market would build at Waiuku, because of it being a rural town and the current character and the community that's there. So again, that's something that we would investigate more thoroughly when we consider the merits of the application, but for the purposes of understanding what they are proposing, they've maintained that the capacity would be 700, and that's what their infrastructure assessments are based on.
Okay, that sounds like an outcome that Council signalled in its submission to the bill, ironically. Okay, my other question, I think I've satisfied my questions. Look, members, are there other questions here? Councillor Newman?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good morning, Celia and Chloe. Just with respect to the funding available for infrastructure, and I know that, look, I've seen this play out before. Can you just confirm the usual process here is that the application indicates that they believe if an infrastructure solution is in place at hand, probably through their assessment of the asset management plans and the development plans of water care, for example, around the plants, and that they can basically connect into, and that they would pay a contribution. But it is quite possible, isn't it, that through the consideration of the plan change, they will say actually that they'll make their contribution, but once this particular plan change is live zoned, like a lot of plan changes get live zoned, they say, well, actually the burden actually falls on the council. And isn't there a risk here that that's precisely what's going to happen, that for the purpose of the plan change application, we get developers who are quite confident about their ability to contribute, but once the plan change has been adopted, then we see the development agreements seem to get skinnier and skinnier and skinnier when it comes to the developer's willingness to pay, and the burden of cost seems to be socialised back onto council. Isn't that the usual practice?
Through the chair, that is a risk. So what the applicant's assessment is basically relying on development contributions and IGCs to water care to say that that's a significant contribution to the costs of infrastructure upgrades with 700 dwellings. Water care in particular are saying that they haven't I guess the issue at this point is that water care hasn't quantified the costs of what the upgrades would be. So yes, they've acknowledged there will be upgrades. They haven't quantified what we don't know what the proportion of those costs would be assigned to the developer at this point. So that will have to be worked through when the merits of the plan change are considered in a lot of detail, and I think is a key concern for this plan change. So I would expect that there would need to be some further certainty provided through the process that that is quantified, and that the developer confirms what proportion they would be willing to pay, and ideally you would have a funding agreement at the time you're considering that plan change, so it's all very clear and it's not left up to debate at the subdivision stage.
Thank you. If I can follow up, Chair, but yeah, look, I mean, I can see what's going to happen here. The plant is going to be developed by water care for the future growth of Waiuku, and all of a sudden a plan change has popped up and it's been live zoned, which basically wasn't in sequence, and is presumed to basically swallow up a lot of the latent capacity that would be forecast by water care, but which water care wasn't initially considering because this plan change didn't exist at the time that the plant upgrade was considered. That's a real risk here, and my concern, Chair, and I think Chloe is addressing this through comments, is that this forces a real fast tracking of costings for what the infrastructure would cost, but actually the infrastructure costs will go higher, and almost certainly we can have a development agreement in principle, but if the costs aren't fully quantified at the time that agreement is prepared for the purpose of the consideration of the the plan change. If the cost goes higher in the future, the developers will say, we didn't agree to that. We agreed at the consideration of the plan change to the cost that was agreed at the time, and that's our contribution. But in a few years' time, if the cost is 30% higher because actually we've done the proper economics around that development of the plant and the necessary infrastructure, there's a real risk here that cost could end up falling back on the ratepayer and not the developer, because the developer wasn't party to the revised cost. Would that be fair, Chloe?
There is a risk of that. I guess just to reflect on what the applicant's assessment is. So in terms of your latent, swallowing up the latent capacity, I agree that's essentially what the applicant is suggesting they could do. The economic analysis suggests, and well, it's the view of the applicant that latent development capacity isn't feasible. So in their view, there is quite a lot of latent capacity and quite a lot of growth. I think the Watercare's study for the sub-regional wastewater plant is a population of 16,000 at Waiuku, and as I said, I think we're approximately somewhere between 8 and 9. So there is quite a lot of capacity there. I do think there is still a lot of investigation to determine whether or not, that would provide for this. There's a series of options. One could be that the applicant is right and there is capacity when they get down and actually look at the numbers, and then there's other options around how much additional capacity is required, and that level of detail gets sort of worked through, I guess, the plan change process. But yes, sorry, to answer your question, Councillor Newman, I expect there always is a risk with a funding agreement that those prices could increase.
Chair,
Mr. Chair, it's Megan here. I'm happy also to.
Megan.
Yeah, do you mind? Sorry, Councillor
Yes,
Newman,
please.
you take your thoughts again, but just wanted to confirm again, we have been speaking with you last year, or really in the last 18 months or so. This is this big difficulty with us having to respond to plan changes and private plan changes, as the chair mentioned earlier, but also attempting to plan into the future for infrastructure requirements that we have, but not just that, but just in order to make good communities, and quality environments for people. But we're having to respond to private plan changes, and the Act at the moment has very limited reasons or ability for us at this stage of a process to kind of reject or not continue through to a process of looking at the merits and looking at all of this detail. It may be that once we go through the processing, that the application is rejected or declined. It may also be approved, but that's not the question that we're being asked at the moment. And this is the process, that we get to, and it becomes difficult for us. We try and provide you really clear advice, and to tell you that there will be some issues, I think, particularly in the infrastructure area, and which is why you see a chair's recommendation about council doing a submission on this to ensure that these issues are raised and considered when it actually comes to the point of making a decision. But you are absolutely right in some of the risks you're raising. There may well be some costs that may or may not be fully met by the developers or the beneficiaries of this plan change and others, but that is what we need to keep working through this process. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Well, Chair, if I can just conclude with my comment on your indulgence, Chair. Yeah, I'm certainly not. I'm not going to vote to decline the application, because there's no legal grounds to do so, in my view. But this is a good example, Chair, of why the officials from MB and Ministry for the Environment need to sit alongside council staff and Watercare and Auckland Transport staff in relation to these plan change requests, because they need to understand the fruits of their analysis, which I think is pretty narrow. Because if the council were to reject this plan change request in the future, whatever the merits of the council's decision around this, or to argue against the plan change at a hearing, The council will be perceived to be the great big roadblock to developing a solution to Auckland's housing shortage. But in reality, there are massive infrastructure deficits, and there is no obvious way to fund this because the developers' commercial interests are not served by the developer paying the full cost. They want to minimise the cost to them and socialise the cost for everybody else. So, thank you to Chloe and to Megan for reflecting on this. But this is yet another iteration of the same old problem. The cost will go significantly higher as we understand the need to address the infrastructure. I'm sure the developer will say, well, actually, most of that is not us. They will say that's a revision of a cost based on an assumption in the future. We identified our cost as per a development agreement very early in the process, and we had to do that because as we had to be party to that because we had the plan change request. Once this is live zoned, the pressure will come on the council to fund the lot. And it's a real trouble. It's very troubling because we know that the development agreements, the contributions that we receive do not meet the cost of these developments. They meet a part of it, but the costs will be much higher, and the ratepayers can't afford that, but we'll be up for the cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, you've been consistent in that argument, and as have I, and I think a growing number, if not all, the members around our table are expressing those concerns. So look, I really appreciate you reiterating those. They are very real challenges and very real risks that we're likely to face again. So thank you. And now, members, are there other questions before we go to speaking on this? I've got member Glenn Wilcox to speak. No more questions. So members, just in moving this, sorry, I have a question, do I?
Yes, sorry, I just can't organise myself to put it in the sidebar. Sorry, apologies. I have a question, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Henderson. Sorry, Councillor Desley Simpson.
It's me, sorry. Yes, I was just listening to Daniel state the obvious. I was going to suggest that maybe we put something more specific than and any other relevant matter in C, noting that it is things like infrastructure, the infrastructure costs, etc. But my question is to staff, if we leave it open, does that mean we have more discretion to raise all sorts of things by leaving it as and any other relevant matter?
That was the intention.
Mr. Chair,
I'll go to Megan.
Mr. Chair, I'm
yes.
happy to answer that.
Megan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Councillor Simpson. Yes, as you see in recommendation C, you'll see that we're talking about any matter that the council might be concerned with. We have put a noting there about infrastructure, because that certainly will be one of the big things. But, there's been questions around perhaps climate implications and things like that. So I'm in your hands, but my recommendation is that I think C is fine, and it enables both staff to do some more work, but also the delegated group to just consider what the areas of concern or support, of course, might be for the council. So I'm quite happy with C, but in your hands, Councillor Simpson, if you wanted to suggest anything else. Thanks.
Thank you, Megan. No, Chair, I'm happy with C. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Simpson. Thanks for raising that too. It's important that we capture everything. There's been a good discussion that's occurred here this morning, and I was thinking of adding the Chair and Deputy Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee as well. But look, we won't change it. But Councillor Hills, Councillor Coombe, I'll make sure that you're given an early heads up on the draft submission, and then we'll make sure we go to all the councillors and get feedback as well before it is formalised. So members, I've moved this and the Deputy Mayor has seconded. I don't think for either of us it's tacit approval of this private plan change, not remotely so. We're accepting it for processing as the MPSUD reinforces now, even more so than prior. So, but that There are a range of issues here that we need to pick up, not least being the transport deficit in this area, the water deficit, supply and the taking of wastewaters, natural water, stormwaters, big issues around soils, soils that take thousands of years to develop and then can be obliterated in one swoop of a digger or a bulldozer. Questions of who pays and who does not pay, and we will make sure that is all covered, and we will definitely address the climate impacts in our submission as well. We will cover all of that ground. So in supporting these motions today, I don't believe any of us are signing this off with agreement that it is a grand idea worth implementing. It is an application that now needs to go through process, and it will be tested by our council staff and others. So that is the intention. It is moved and seconded. I will now go to comment from member Glenn Wilcox.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I think we find ourselves in an unenviable position here. I'm not persuaded personally that the social, economical, cultural well-being of the people that either move there or the town is going to be enhanced. I'm very concerned that there is no discussion really about medical facilities if they're talking about over 55s. And I think the thing that concerns me most is that we haven't even done a structure plan, so we've got no idea of the costs that are going to come upon us. And the final issue is actually we have three third-tier towns basically in Auckland, that's being Helensville, Wellsford and Waiuku. And this could turn into the Wild West really fast if we're not careful. And you're quite right, agreeing to this does not give it approval at all. It's just that it has to go through the process. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Henderson, your call.
Thank you, Chair. I'm always reasonably happy to follow my learned colleagues in these kind of debates because I'm reasonably soothed by your comments, Chair. Also thanking Member Wilcox as well for his comments, which I fully endorse. And finally, Councillor Simpson, I was about to raise the same issue, so I'm glad that you raised it as well, because we do want to have a catch-all which acknowledges some of the other concerns that we've talked about. I'm not quite convinced about the soil issue, although I'm happy to kind of follow advice on that situation. But I think at some point we do need to put a line in the sand and say, look, the climate impacts what we're doing is just too high. We can't keep building things that are going to increase our climate emissions and, on the other hand, declare a climate emergency and have these grand goals for reducing emissions. It's just not consistent, and it's not something that residents expect council to do. So but I acknowledge that these concerns will be picked up by the Chair and Deputy Chair and a member of the IMSB. I'm really comfortable with that approach. So yeah, please don't take my vote in support for a vote to support the development, which as it stands, frankly, I don't. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. We won't, and thank you. I'll now go to Councillor Dalton with the last comment.
Thank you, Chair. And really, I just wanted to commend Chloe and her responses to all of the questions that have been asked today. They were really helpful for me. I thought there was good context put around the discussion around the productive soil. And I also think there was good context given towards some of the economics and the benefits that this would hold for Waiuku. And I think it would be good for Waiuku, knowing the area a bit, but also knowing people who live in the area. But you know, it's out of sequence, as everybody is saying, and the discussions that we had last year about how we pay for infrastructure and what our priorities were going to be have somewhat been changed by the legislation. So I think for us, the discussion probably has already been had, but for me it is about how we navigate this, and Megan has said some work is going to be done on this, as did Chloe, around the discussions of the funding of infrastructure and looking at the different models. So we're not continually opposing it at this point because we're going to support it at this point, but we need to be able to provide housing in an area that is probably going to be more affordable than a lot of places. And we're making some broad assumptions that everyone that's going to buy there is going to drive where? Into Auckland for their job in the CBD. We don't know that. So we get quite hung up on all of the things that we don't want to happen, and we will miss out on enabling some good things that could happen. So I understand the financials of it and the sequencing of it, and I support the recommendations and would like just to make sure that we are going to figure out how we address the costs of infrastructure when we as we continue to go down this journey of new housing areas and developments. So Chloe, you were really clear, really helpful with context of how you presented today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. That concludes those speaking to this. But members, I've just got a message coming through, and this is one of the challenges of electronic meetings and our remote working. Message from our Chief of Strategy via legal that we just need to look at something. So before we conclude this and go to the vote, we're not in vote yet. With your goodwill, members, and this is not consistent with the standing orders, but I think we need to hear from our Chief of Strategy. Is everybody in agreement on that? I just need to check. Everybody in agreement? We want the right outcomes from our meetings.
Yes.
Okay, so I will go to the Chief of Strategy, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee. Yes, I am sorry, this is a little out of sequence. We've just been having some background conversations, as the Chair has said, because we're remote, it's a little bit harder for us to provide you that clarity of advice sometimes. We just want to ensure that we're making the right references for you just at the beginning of the recommendation. So maybe, Sophie, if you could just move up, please. It'll be probably somewhere just in that first paragraph at A, where we're talking about clause 25(2)(b. All we're wanting to do is just make sure we've got some references to these newer parts of the Act where it relates to these new residential standards. Just so it's not changing any of the content of anything you've talked about or where you're going to go. It's just making sure that we reference the right part of the Act, so it's as accurate a resolution as possible. We're just drafting that at the moment. I'm just checking to see whether we've got those words yet. We may just need 1 or 2 minutes, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. So it doesn't change the content, it's just making sure we reference the right pieces of the legislation for you to make your decision. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Members, I think we might just let us take 5 minutes. Let's just stand adjourned for 5 minutes. I know we don't have far to go. All members, we could carry on and deal with the procedural parts of the balance of our agenda, but I think, Kalinda, you're involved with the discussions with Megan, so I don't think you can cover the balance of the agenda at this time. You need to discuss this with Megan, Kalinda?
I believe that we have just got the wording just now through from our legal team. If Megan's happy to continue with this, then we can go ahead. Although I'm happy to discuss the summary of information items and finish that up, Chair, to give the staff more time. I'm fine to continue. Let's go to 11.
We'll come back to 10 members. Let's go to 11, and that's just the summary. So I'll move the motion on the screen. Can I have a second, please? Councillor Bartley?
I'll second.
Happy to second,
Deputy Mayor.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councillor Bartley, thanks, Deputy Mayor. I'll take Councillor Bartley. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye. We're on 11. All those in favour say aye.
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 Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Item 12 is consideration of extraordinary business. As I previously indicated, none has been raised. So that takes us back now to item 10. And how are we going there, Megan?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, look, I'm just sorry. Could you just perhaps give us maybe that 5-minute break would be great, and then we'll be able to come back to you. Thank you.
Look, let's take 5 minutes, members, and we will come back here at what's that? 11:50. Is it 11? Let's just make it 11:55. 11:55, and we'll reconvene.